Shalom. Let me get straight into this lesson. But I'm going to go into this history that most people know nothing of. That's been labeled, these people have been labeled Native Americans, so-called, and Indians. But these really are Israelites. I'm going to prove that to you. So when the so-called white man came and said he discovered America, as we know as America today, there was Israelites over here because you got out so many artifacts that they found of Hebrew and Block Hebrew writing, throughout the whole Americas, starting from North, Central, and South America. These were the 10 tribes that came over here out of the Apocrypha, right? So what you're looking at is something that you're not going to never see in mainstream history. The brown-skinned so-called Native Americans, which they'll be the tribe of Reuben, Gad, Naphtali, so on and so forth. And you got the tribes that was in Mexico and Cuba, Brazil, so on and so forth. These are Israelites. They renamed them these corporate names that you know today. So right here, check it out. Well, you think they had this brown skin image on the Washington Redskins as the mascot, right? Usually when you see the Native Americans in the modern sense of them, they've been whitewashed. All right, look at this Jake here. He actually looked like the Jake from Sons of, can't think of the brother channel name, Sons of Jacob. Right here. This was on the east coast of New York. So-called black people, the west coast of California, down south Mississippi, in Midwest Wisconsin. Right? These Israelites ruled the so-called Americas. Right here. This is the image from 1925. This was in southern New England. See? We're not just saying, and Jackson say this, Jackson do this, and in the past when we was going to there, so they got Indian in their family, but they were saying it out of ignorance, but that is true. What they do have is the Northern Kingdom, right? Gad, Reuben, so on and so forth. They're the tribes they descend from. These would be from the 12 tribes of Israel. You see these so-called black people. And Malcolm, the elder Malcolm, actually brought out this information, very, very key information that you need to know. When these devils was enslaving us, right? So that's why Jacob said this too. Jacob said we was already over here. That's true. So the tribes of Israel, some of them was already here. The southern kingdom primarily was taken from the west coast of Africa, right, and all over to be shipped into what we know as North America, the Caribbean, Central America, etc. And they even had slaves they were sending back into so-called Europe, what that's really is supposed to be called Asia. So it's a lot of vast history to understand. But these devils reclassified a lot of these so-called Native Americans as so-called black and shipped them out to different plantations. Bet you didn't know that history. Right here. These the original so-called Mexicans. Right? It says the Negro type is seen in most of ancient Mexican sculpture. It says we Negroes figured frequently in the most remote traditions of some American playboys. Playboys? It says it is to the race doubtlessly belongs to most ancient skeletons. Distinct from the red American race, they even, they call them, red people, but the Edomites really are the red people. We are copper-colored people collectively, but you have millions of Israelites that's going to look like different hues, right? You got millions of Israelites that's the complexion of Chris Brown and brighter and darker than, dark chocolate color. So it's different, shades. which have been found various places from Bolivia to Mexico. It is likely that we repeat America was a Negro continent, so-called Negro. You go on right here, you go to all these so-called Caribbeans, Jamaica, Cuba, Brazil. These all our people. You know, not every single so-called Cuban and not every single so-called Jamaican is our people, but I'm talking about the Israelites that's among them, the so-called Haitians, to be the Levites, right here. So-called Indians, you'll never see this in no mainstream history. Because usually when you see the so-called Native Americans and the so-called Mexicans and so on and so forth, they're lighter skinned. They look like so-called white people. Check this out. So this history that you don't know anything about, I'm going to be doing lessons going into this vast history. There's so much to unlock. Right here, it says the people in this mural have locks, and the people claiming to descend from them today don't have any locks. Don't have locks. Show me 15 people who claim they descended from the Mayans today with locks. I'll wait. So you see the original so-called Mayans were melanated people, right? It says right here, you see? This was a ruler, right? North and South America. Look at this. So what the so-called white man would do is when he goes to these different places and colonize, he'll call the people savages. But yet he's a savage. He the one that rapes, rob, and kills and destroy, take resources, cut off people's limbs, feed them to alligators, feed them to the dogs, right? Change their name, change their identity, strip them from everything that they knew, and give them new corporate identities. And tell them they was nobody but slaves. But they're not going to never show you this history. So-called Indian settlement. So right here, this is Montezuma meets Cortez. All this rich history that you know nothing about. Look at this. These original Native Americans, so-called. Indians, so-called Native Americans, and they massacred millions of them. They put them on reservations, and they have destroyed them, like the curses say will come upon the Israelites. And you see these devils in this picture, and you see how the so-called Native Americans look, the original, right? America, separated from Europe by a wide ocean, was inhabited by a distinct people divided into separate nations, independent of each other and of the rest of the world, having institutions of their own and governing themselves by their own laws, right? So all you know is the so-called white man constitution laws, which that wasn't written for you, because when the Constitution was written, you was considered 3/5 of a man, and you were still in slavery, our people. So that wasn't written for you, but you Jake's so stupid. You say you know your constitutional rights, right? That wasn't for you. Still ain't for you. Right here, it says in 1873, when delegation of 9, I'm not gonna even try to say that name, men and 3 women arrived in Washington, D.C. to meet with President U.S.S. Grant, a vast network. So you see how they look. If you didn't have these pictures, you wouldn't know this history. Look at this. These are original so-called Native Americans. They'll never show you this in any mainstream source. Look at this, Jake. I believe that's his wife or whatever, the woman he's dealing with. Today, these men will be labeled as so-called black men. Right here. So we're not just making things up out of thin air. You just been lied to about everything that you know. And it's a hard for you to come out this brainwashing a lot of times. That's why repetition is the key. That's why sometimes we repeat ourselves over and over and over and over, because we have to re-indoctrinate your mind to the truth. Like they've been indoctrinating you, repeating the same thing over and over. Right here. And this is on the Washington skin, what it was on the Washington Redskins helmet. This brown colored so-called Indian, because they know something that you don't know. Look at this guy here, Geno Smith. He played in the NFL. And you look at to the left, or however you're looking at it, Blackfoot Chief. Look like he's goddamn reincarnated, like he's reincarnated back as Geno Smith. Or this could be his forefather. We don't know. But they got to be related. See, you know, give me 1 second. And again, it's a lot of vast history. Matter of fact, let me get this scripture real quick. 1 second. Matter of fact, before I get that, I'm going to get this real quick. I'm going to read this. It says all, and see that word black is a very hateful, evil, demonic word that they have attached to you. And a lot of you can't come out of that blackness. It's a real demon. It says all so-called black Americans, earliest grandparents were not born on plantations. All dark-skinned. Negro slaves were not Africans. Africans is new speak, right? Africa was renamed that by the so-called white man. So there's no such thing as Africans. The Hamites and Israelites and other nations spread in that land, but mostly Hamites. It says we need to stop assuming mental inferiority, regurgitating slave lies from so-called white people. Actually look at our grandparents' history by doing their genealogy. That's folly. Record search. We'll find that our earliest grandparents in the United States didn't even begin with slavery, plantations or not. So, yeah, you had a bulk of so-called black, if you want to use that term, people that was already in the Americas, a multitude of them, millions of them. And these was the other tribes of Israel, right? Now you're going to have Israelites that look like all ethnicities because all the women that they dealt with. It's just not hard to figure this out. So you're going to have Israelites that look like so-called white people. You're going to have Israelites that look like so-called Chinese people, right? And so on and so forth. All right, so let's get it. Let me get this scripture. Get the scripture, 2nd Ezra 13, and let me go to 40. It says, those are the 10 tribes which were carried away prisoner out of their own land at the time of Hosea, Salakia, the king, because Hosea was the prophet, and Hosea was the king, so it's two different people, right? Whom Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria, led away captive, and he carried them over the waters, and so came they into another land. It says 41, but they took this counsel among themselves, that they would leave the multitude of the heathen and go farther into a farther country where never mankind dwelt. 42, that they might there keep their statutes, which they never kept in their own land. Right? It says 43, and there entered into the Euphrates by the narrow places of the river. It says 44, for the Most High then showed signs for them and held still the flood till they were passed over to fulfill prophecy. It says 45, for through that country there was a great way to go, namely of a year and a half, in the same region is called Azareth. So that's America that they came to. And that's what Solomon was sending, the king of Tyre, the Navy, he was sending them to the Americas, and would take them a year and a half to get in, a year and a half to get back, if I'm not mistaken, so that he can come up to the same time frame for them to get there. And it's America. Hopefully this lesson was edifying. Call Allah Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Rakat, Kodash. Shalom.